I said, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up, but I got to study under Neil Postman. I called New York City Information. I said, does NYU have a number? I got right on the phone with Neil Postman, and I just kind of went crazy. He said, I don't have all day. What did you call about? We had a 650 square foot apartment. Had 2 kids when we moved in and 6 when we moved out. And
Wow.
it was pretty tight.
Wow.
It was probably the 10 best years of our life. All technologies give and take away. All technology is a Faustian bargain. And it's a trade-off. It's not all good or all bad. It's both good and bad in simultaneous terms. Postman's books are really a secular form, I think, of having a theological conversation.
In this episode of the Wayfaring Stranger podcast, I talked to Dr. Reed Schuchardt. Dr. Schuchardt is a professor of communication at Wheaton College and has been since 2007. He got his PhD in media ecology while studying under the renowned media theorist Neil Postman. In this conversation, we talk about the invisible power media exercises over those who are unaware of its influence, what effect these paradigms have on our faith, as well as what it was like studying under Neil Postman. I hope you enjoy this episode. You didn't have a normal childhood, right? You didn't grow up with the television.
Yeah. If that's the definition of normal, no, I did not have a normal childhood. I was raised by 2 Swarthmore College graduates who, for whatever reason, not religious reasons, didn't want a television in 1961 when they got married. I was born in 68 and never had in my childhood a television. Even after my parents divorced, never had one. And then in my adulthood, I've never had one. In fact, it was the one non-negotiable. I said to my wife, that and smoking. Can't ever have a TV, can't ever smoke. And
Wow.
She said, okay.
All right.
But that was the fact of not owning a television. Well, I guess both things. Well, 3 things. I was raised overseas in the Caribbean, in St. Martin, after my parents divorced when I was 15 months old. Lived there for 7 years. The fact that we didn't have a television, and then the fact that at age 9, we moved to the States, to Savannah, Georgia. So the media-free nature of my childhood, the cultural shock and whiplash of moving at age 9, and the influence the television had on all my classmates, especially in the States, suddenly made me realize very early on, wow, there's something really different about everybody than I'm currently aware of. And so I was always trying to figure out what it was. And I'd never understood it in grade school or high school or even college until I heard of Neil Postman. And my mother had heard a sermon by Terry Johnson at Independent Presbyterian Church in Savannah, where he quoted page 9 of Postman's book on the Decalogue, that it was a strange injunction to include as part of an ethical system unless its author assumed a connection between the forms of human communication and the quality of a culture. And this was a commentary on the second commandment, on making no images. And so my mother heard this sermon, wrote down the name of the book, bought the book, and said, I got to send this to Reed. So she sends it to me while I'm in school at Swarthmore as an English major. And this just changed my whole life. So I read that. I read Amusing Ourselves to Death. And then I read Technopoly right after. And said to my wife, because I was just recently married, as a senior in college, I said, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up, but I got to study under Neil Postman. And so I called New York City Information. I said, does NYU have a number? Yeah, they connected me. I said, can I talk to the Department of Culture and Communication? And I got right on the phone with Neil Postman, and I just kind of went crazy that I'd gotten through to him, that he was still alive.
Wow.
And he said, I don't have all day. What did you call about? And I said, oh, yeah. What do I have to do to be a student of yours? And he says, well, the first thing you would do is apply.
Yeah.
So I then got connected to the admissions office, applied to the program that would allow me to take the most classes with him, which I didn't know, what that was called. Well, that's the master's degree in media ecology. So I did that. And then after 18 months, what do you do with a master's degree in media ecology? Well, you go back to work. But he invited me personally to join the PhD program, which I didn't, what's a PhD and why would I do that? So I didn't know really what I was doing, but I so enjoyed studying under him and learning from him that I said, well, I'll regret it the rest of my life if I don't say yes to this invitation. So I did. And then, PhD is just a license to teach. So I then became a college professor. And we moved to Switzerland, then to Maine, and then we've been in Wheaton, Illinois. And I've been teaching at Wheaton College since 2007. So the answer to what does a television do to a culture, that was really, really, sort of almost every PhD that you meet, not exclusively, but a whole lot of people, especially in the social sciences, what they're actually majoring in is their childhood traumas and neuroses, And so you're trying to figure out, where did I come from? What's going on here? Who am I,
Yeah.
So it was terrific for that. But I was in grad school 10 years because I was working, supporting Rachel. And we had 2 kids when we started and 6 when we finished. Now we have 10. So,
Wow.
We were always busy, and
Right.
I was going to school at night. But yeah, that was my introduction to media ecology. And media ecology is the study of how the form, not the content of media, changes the pace, pattern, and scale of a culture, and whether it hinders or enhances human flourishing in a sort of macro societal way, but also, in the anecdotal personal level.
Yeah, I'm just now realizing how few people my age have heard or read Neil Postman. And it's shocking to me because I thought it was like, oh, this is amazing. Like, this is an amazing book. I'll be honest, though, I was a victim of technology or whatever because when I was a student in high school, I did use SparkNotes to do some of my assignments. So, but it's funny, I've actually read Postman more and interacted with his ideas more after high school than during, probably even when I was there. But I always found it fascinating, even if I was lazy. So,
Yeah. Well, he explained your laziness to you.
Absolutely.
And it made sense. You're like, oh, that's why video games are more appealing. That's why school's so boring and I'm so depressed. Or that's why books put me to sleep.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like video games I had for about a year or two from when I was 6 to 8. And then
Okay.
I got rid of them to buy a cymbal for my drum set because they're expensive. And
Yeah.
so my parents were like, well, you gotta, how are you going to pay for that? I'm like, well, I'll just sell my Nintendo 64. They're like, all right. And so did that. Never bought video games or interacted with them ever since.
Wow.
That's not my thing. My thing was I want a video camera. I want to film stuff.
Yeah.
I want guitar. I want more stuff for my drum set, whatever, When I was a kid, I was like, I'm just playing with something somebody else made. I'm not making anything.
Right.
And to me, that was boring.
Yeah, that was the number one thing I think that Postman showed me in both his writing and his teaching, was that what the media sort of onslaught of the 20th century and the electronic media did more than anything else was convert you from a participant and creator of culture to a just passive spectator.
Yeah.
And I hated that.
Yeah.
Hated that.
Absolutely. And so to me, I was always kind of restless and always wanting to do something. I think I get that from my mom and my grandfather. He was like that even in his 80s. Like, he was a fine artist for the last 40 years of his life. And,
What kind of art did he do?
oil painting
Oh, okay. Nice.
with a palette knife. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Carol Forsyth. I'll show you some of that after. But yeah.
Okay, yeah.
But he was like that. Like, I remember growing up because they built a back house for themselves in the backyard of my parents' house. And he couldn't just sit around all day. Like, he'd be like fixing something or hammering something or whatever. And he's just always like that. And it's kind of what my mom's like too. But I think I have some of that restless energy in me where I just have to be making something or doing something.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about what it was like studying under Neil Postman.
It was like, he was old when I got to him. So I studied at NYU for 10 years from 1995 to 2005. He died in 2003. So I was under his teaching for the last 8 years of his life.
Wow.
He died of lung cancer in October of 2003. And it was like having the best, most wonderful, lucid, sharp, and funny grandfather who just thought you were his favorite child and wanted to tell you story after story after story. As one of his colleagues put it, he wasn't a very organized or strict professor, but I would come to class early. I would stay late. I would, linger in the department hall in case I could get an invitation to lunch. I soaked it up and I loved it.
Yeah.
So He was very astute. One of the things that shocked me, and I forget if this was the master's or PhD program, but I was, really devoted to reading everything I could get my hands on and knowing, well, what's he thinking now? What's he writing now? What's he, noodling on now? And it was when his book, The End of Education, came out. There was a reading in one of the bookstores in New York City. And I showed up at the reading, and I couldn't believe that none of my classmates were there.
Wow.
And he was surprised that I was there because this wasn't on the syllabus and this wasn't something that was expected or required. And why are you here, Reed? I was like, well, because you're here. Like, why wouldn't I be here? And so I was a true, what the kids would call a fanboy these days.
Right.
But I didn't care. I wanted to hear everything he had to say, every possible chance. And he had just a way with words, a way with turning a phrase. He taught me almost everything I know about public speaking, even though I never took a public speaking class.
What did he teach you about that?
He taught me to be extemporaneous. He taught me to be conversational. Some of the things were surprising. One of them was, he was very gifted at, making a through line of his claims and his points and then stopping and saying, oh, that reminds me. And then he'd go off on this digression that seemed like it just occurred to him. But if you got to see his legal yellow pad that he wrote everything down on, the digression was also part of the prepared remarks. And so he would write, and he taught us to write for the ear, not for the eye. And that was a huge, huge help in my own writing and my own teaching and my own public speaking, that you don't want to impress people with 50-cent words. You want to actually speak to them as though you're speaking to them. So my master's was in media ecology and film, so I did some cinema study at NYU as well.
Oh, cool.
And I had long been persuaded that the soundtrack and the dialogue was the most important part of the movie.
Yeah.
And the visuals were just there to kind of guide along the conversation and the information that was coming in through the ear. So I already had a sort of bias towards that. And that's, consonant with the Western theological tradition, which is God speaks and man listens. And in a perfect world, you don't see God, you hear him. And it's when you start to look at things, things start to go wrong. So there's a profound sense in which, people forget that a perfect world is Eden, where you are hearing God but not seeing him. And so the command to not make any images is not, I think it's not possible in any time in cultural history to obey that command in a sense, but it's also always wise to remember you put the ear before the eye and you have an audio visual world, not a visual audio world. So the fact that we live in a world where seeing is believing, I think that's the tragedy.
That's fascinating. So he kind of taught you other life lessons that would be helpful to you, like speaking. Were there any things like that?
Yeah.
Other things that he taught you about?
One of them was how to negotiate for the best speaker's fee. And I think this got written down somewhere in somebody's essay, but it was based on, I forget who they were, but two basketball players. Again, if I'd had a television, I could tell you the names, but it was two basketball players in the 70s. And so when he would get invited to give a graduation speech or a talk at a school, he would say, well, who gave the talk last year? And they would tell him, and he'd say, and how much did you pay them? And they would tell him, and he'd say, okay, I just want $1 more. And they'd say, just $1 more? Well, that's very reasonable, Dr. Postman. Do you mind if we ask why? Well, yeah, it's so that you're getting the most highly paid speaker you've ever had give this speech. And I know I'm going to give the best speech I could possibly give because I'm being paid more than anybody else has ever been paid for this speech.
Wow.
And so it's mutually incentivizing. And that was good internal motivation advice as well as good economic advice. So he was a shrewd and wise person in practical things as well as intellectual things. He was criticized by, I think, basically small-minded men for just being a popularizer, for just popularizing the ideas of Marshall McLuhan or Jacques Ellul or Walter Wrong or Lewis Mumford. And if you read everything he wrote, that's not really true. But if you read everything he wrote, you also, there was a lot of truth to the fact that he did do a great job popularizing and synthesizing a whole bunch of other people's work. But again, I think that's exactly what a student bewildered by the 20th and 21st century needs is like, wait, what just happened? How did all this come about? And why am I in the world I'm in? It's very, very confusing and bewildering. And so I think you need a popularizer. In other words, you need a generalist much more than a specialist these days. And so that's the other thing that media ecologists are in general they are known as generalists, and they know a little bit about everything. Whereas the specialist, Marshall McLuhan famously said, the specialist is the person who knows so much about so little that they eventually know everything about nothing.
That's good. I like that.
So he was not a specialist. He was a generalist. And so that was the other reason it was so fun to be around him. You could ask him, about his favorite baseball team. You could ask him about the weather. You could ask him about basketball, which he played. You could ask him about, surfing in Hawaii. You could ask him about the latest book by the latest author that everybody was reading. And he would have something interesting, funny, or wise to say on just about anything.
What types of things did he enjoy? Like, did he enjoy movies? Did he enjoy reading, traveling? Like, what was his kind of like, okay, I'm going to take some time. I'm just going to do this. I enjoy doing this.
He played basketball since college. And up until, I think, the last year when he got sick, I think he played basketball with his graduate students and other colleagues every year. I don't know if he did it at NYU, but he did it at the annual media ecology conference for the grad students. And that was always a pleasure to see.
Wow.
So he liked basketball. He was a smoker. He liked smoking. He liked sitting around and having a conversation with a cigarette.
Yeah.
He liked, walking and talking, and he liked discussing, sort of news of the day and, cultural trends and what's happening in the world, because he was right there in the heart of Greenwich Village. New York City is the, cultural capital of America, if not the world. And
Yeah.
so he once famously said he didn't think he could live in a place like Switzerland, which was too boring because it was so safe and neutral and nothing ever happened. Whereas a place like New York, there's always something to talk about and do and, kind of go out and see. So
That makes sense.
yeah, he did enjoy watching television to watch his baseball team. And he enjoyed his students. I mean, he really would invite you to lunch if you happen to be in the department, and he'd take you up to the faculty lounge, and he would pay for it. It was very generous, and he just liked sort of the conversation about life and what's worth knowing, what's worth doing. And he had a quote on his wall from Goethe, and I'm paraphrasing, so don't take this verbatim, but something about every day try to, read a few good sentences, think a few good thoughts, and say a few nice words, something like that. And that was really, I think, his MO. He certainly lived up to that.
Yeah. What was that time like for you in New York? You were in New York?
Yeah, we lived in New York, as I say. Went to school in Greenwich Village at NYU. I went to church in Greenwich Village. I had jobs in New York City in public relations. I worked for Disney for 2 years. I did branding and marketing and advertising on Madison Avenue. So our whole life was in New York. Our friends were in Brooklyn, but we spent the night, I say, in Jersey City, New Jersey. So, because we couldn't afford Manhattan. So we had a 650 square foot apartment. Had 2 kids when we moved in and 6 when we moved out. And
Wow.
it was pretty tight.
Wow.
But it was great. It was probably the 10 best years of our life. We had first Friday of the month parties, and sometimes we had 75 people just jammed in there, and it was just
In your apartment?
in the apartment.
How's
Yeah.
that even possible?
It was pretty tight. It was really,
Wow.
really.
What were those parties?
It was kind of a BYOB party, and we'd all cook something, and we'd fill the bathtub with ice, and people would bring beer and wine, and it would start at 6 p.m. and we'd go till 2 a.m.
Wow.
And it was a terrific, it started because when our third child was born, Rachel and I realized we couldn't afford to hire a babysitter and go out to eat. And so we're like, well, we have to have a social life. What are we going to do?
Right.
So we said, well, let's have a party that we're the host of and let other people come. But if they have children, also bring their children so that both the adults and the kids can have a party. And see, since we can't afford to feed or house or entertain that many people, we'll make it a BYOB party so people bring their own, contribution to the party. And it was just, it just worked. It was funny because we tried to replicate it when we got to suburbia, and it didn't work. But in the city, probably the number one affliction of city life is loneliness.
Yeah.
And so people found it a monthly antidote to loneliness in a way that, in some ways was like church, but in other ways was even better than church, because you could actually let your hair down and just be yourself and, eat some good food. And if it wasn't the food that somebody else had cooked, it was the food that you had brought, that you had cooked.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, it was just a nice social gathering, and we met a lot of people that way and made a lot of friends. And
That's awesome.
New York is such a transient town,
Yeah.
that was the other thing. It was never the same party 2 months in a row. It was always a different party.
I really like the energy when I visited New York. It feels like people have said this, like, feels like everyone's doing something. Like,
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
one's just standing around.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's also why I think celebrities feel safer there, because it's like, no one cares. They're too busy. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I tell my students when you graduate, you got to go to New York, Berlin, or Tokyo, because that's where the young are and that's where the energy is.
Yeah.
But whenever I go to LA, for instance, I just find it like, well, I have to have a very small car with good gas mileage to get anywhere and do anything.
Yeah.
Or I have to just live, work, eat, and sleep in this one neighborhood and not have a car,
Yeah. The limitations of New York, of just the physical, geographical limitations, make it so much more centralized. Same with Chicago. LA's like not quite on the coast, so it's very sprawling and just
Yeah,
endless. But it's cool in its own way. I mean, but yeah, New York it's like if you want to do something, it feels like you're going to be more focused doing something there.
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
I think it's James Howard Kunstler in Geography of Nowhere. He talks about New York, and this is a famous quote from somebody else, but that New York is the largest small town in America. And he means Manhattan specifically, that you can walk everywhere, you can live where you work, and you don't need a car.
Yeah.
But the other thing, like living in Chicagoland now, I've only been into Chicago a couple times a year since being here, but the perception is that everybody's out on the street in New York, whereas in Chicago, you go down the streets and it's like, where's everybody? And they're all indoors, they're all inside.
Yeah.
And they're all like kind of hiding from the weather or from strangers. Whereas
Yeah.
in New York, you go to New York to meet people, even if it's on the subway or even if it's just, out in the parks. You don't get that same feeling in Chicago, even though Chicago's got very friendly people. There is a different effect, I think, of the built man-made environment there.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So were there any areas, because you came into NYU as a believer, right? But you became a
I did.
believer later in life?
Yeah, I became a Christian at age 22 while as undergraduate student at Swarthmore College. And so it was fine doing a master's degree, but I was quite shocked that Postman, knowing, that I was a religious Christian and he was a secular Jew, or a observant but not Orthodox Jew, if you will. He thought of religion as a sort of great wish, or he thought of God as a word in the search for an absence of meaning. But in other places, he would say things like, in one famous interview, he said, I don't know if God has spoken or not, but I choose to live my life as though he has, because I fear that if I do not, I will lose my way. And so it was interesting to me in retrospect, especially, that he invited me personally to join his PhD program, because after 18 months of, having me as a student, he would have known from the essays I had written in his classes, that I was very seriously religious. And so the fact that he didn't just tolerate that, but wanted that as one of his, I was one of 6 students in that cohort, was quite interesting to me. So we had interesting, conversations both in class and outside of class about religion and about Jews and Christians and just about the state of the world and about monotheism in general and about the nature of the medium through which God communicated. So I was always fascinated by Jesus as the Word of God and always kind of mystified by the fact that he never wrote anything down, and how strange it was that he was the Logos or the Word, but he only writes something down with the woman caught in adultery. And so I've studied that, intensely for the last 20 years.
That's fascinating.
And find it very, very interesting. So I think, in the same way that McLuhan's books are really theology books, if you know enough theology to know what he's actually talking about, because he's doing this constant figure ground reversal that's almost a bait and switch. And so he's talking about the figure of the media, but the ground of it is really Catholic medieval theology in many measures.
Can you explain that figure in the ground?
Well, it's a term McLuhan uses from Gestalt psychology. It's just taken from art and art history. The figure of Mona Lisa on the background of the rest of the painting. So it's you could say content and context or figure ground. So Postman's books are really a secular form, I think, of having a theological conversation with the culture. And I think that's one of the reasons why they have such lasting and staying power and why they're so interesting and relevant even 20, 30, 40 years later, that he really did summarize beautifully and articulate very eloquently the theological complexity that the new medium would provide or produce for a culture. So if you do a content analysis of Postman's books and highlight the number of times he's actually mentioning God or religion or church or philosophy, it's pretty frequent. It's pretty consistently there. And even though he wasn't a devout believer of any one particular religion, he found religion to be one of the important things cultures do, and therefore something we should take seriously and not trivialize with a media of trivialization. So I think that's why he liked my candidacy for the program, and I think that's why he invited me, as he knew I wanted to be able to learn how to have that conversation in secular language, even though it was actually ultimately a theological question of epistemology and revelation and conviction.
Did you differ with him on anything in relation to media ecology apart from the theological framework?
Yeah, there was one nagging question I always tried to get him to sort of fess up to or admit that I was right and he was wrong on. And that was just the question of the Faustian bargain of technology, which is to say he was very good at pointing out that all technologies give and take away. All technology is a Faustian bargain. And it's a trade-off. It's not all good or all bad. It's both good and bad in simultaneous terms. And so I would always ask him, sure, but Dr. Postman, in this case, such as the case of television, or such as the case of the internet, such as the case of, whatever the technology was, can't we quantifiably show that the thing it has given us is less valuable than the thing it's taken away? In other words, don't we have enough evidence from, the history of, orality to alphabet to literacy to scribal culture to print culture to electronic culture to digital culture? Don't we have enough evidence to know the thing you give away is more valuable than the thing you're getting? And he would never cop to it. He would never admit it. He would never agree. He would say, well, there's different takes on that. And we maybe, in some cases you could make this. But he never wanted to give a competitive advantage or a leading edge to one side or the other on the outcome. And it wasn't that I was cynical or pessimistic about it. It was just that I thought, man, in all the actual books we're reading and all the evidence we have, the death of a culture is almost always a culture getting supplanted and displaced by a new medium. And so you don't want a sort of one-size-fits-all new medium to turn everything into what it tends to do, which is, the new medium always tries to convert the whole world to itself.
I wonder if maybe the reason he didn't give you that was because there are so many uses of a technology that maybe the ones that would have been more beneficial hadn't been uncovered yet. Because I think of that with like the internet, because he was a little critical of the internet, and even entrepreneurs and business people were critical of the internet in the 90s.
Yeah.
But it's like now that you can tie it to GPS and it's so much more multimodal than it was 20 or 30 years ago, no one could have imagined the applications for it. So I wonder if that's maybe why he wouldn't give you that, because he's like, maybe we don't know the full scope of application.
No, I think that's actually very insightful. He criticized the internet with one email he sent in his entire life in 1997, and that's worth its weight in gold. Reading that email, it's very funny. But 1997, when the internet, which was the year the internet became a mass medium, nobody had invented social media. There was no Facebook. There was no smartphone. And it was still so brand new that he, was pretty much stabbing in the dark and criticizing it. And yet he pointed out a timeless universal truth of all media change. So on the one hand, he acknowledged that, books, it's 500 years later after the invention of the printing press and the book, and we still just learning what a printing press is and what it does to a culture. So it's going to take a while before we really understand what a television is or what the internet is. But in 1997, he said that the internet is just like any other medium, that when taken to its full extent, it will revert to its opposite and become a medium for the expression of all our stupidities. And I can't think of a better summary of most of social media than that.
Right.
That in fact, it's, wow, you're TikTok famous. Wow, that's quite an accomplishment. Except, as my priest says, there's some skill sets you should be ashamed to have. You know? So like I get, and I appreciate, I really do, that Charlie D'Amelio made more a couple of years ago than the CEO of Starbucks by being TikTok famous. So I don't discount that.
Right.
But again, famous for what?
Yeah.
Who is she and what did she do? What has she actually accomplished in this life by being TikTok famous? And the answer is, well, weirdly, I can't think of a single video of hers, even though I've watched dozens. you know?
So it's interesting. So with the internet, can we call that a medium? Because this podcast, a TikTok short, a book, they're all on the internet. So
Yeah.
is the internet's a technology, right? It's not a medium, is it?
Well, that's an interesting distinction. A medium is usually a collection of technologies put to a specific use. So yes, the internet is a medium that is using a lot of different technologies, right? From Wi-Fi routers to electricity to cathode ray tube screens and, all the rest.
Right.
But, well, sorry, what was your original question?
So my thing is, like, I'm looking at the internet as a technology that conducts a lot of mediums. Like, for instance, my Kindle is connected to the internet, so I can have 1,000 books on it.
Yeah.
Charlie D'Amelio got famous off of TikTok, which I don't have.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's like I viewed TikTok as a different medium from YouTube. I think YouTube is much more useful to me.
Yeah.
But there's also different forms of, like, I think short form content is a type of medium. Would I be correct in saying that?
Oh, sure. But like if I say the internet has killed the book, well, was it TikTok that did that? Was it podcast that did that? Was it YouTube that did that? No, and it doesn't matter. The book, which was the dominant medium of the print age, is now dead. And even though you can get your book and books on the internet, from Amazon to having them read aloud on YouTube, Jacques Ellul's Technological Society is on YouTube. It's 11 hours and 36 minutes of reading.
Wow.
So if you want to hear it, you can just push play.
Right.
But how do we know the book has been killed? Well, because we now know from the data that the average college graduate, when they graduate college, they read between 0 and 1 book a year. And the number, when you actually look at it, is closer to 0 than 1.
Wow.
And these are not 8th grade dropouts. These are not high school graduates. These are college graduates. So in Einstein's famous quote, never memorize something you can look up, right? The book is a useless medium because I can just Google that if I need it, right? I can just look it up. And I can just literally ask Alexa or Siri, hey, what was the name of that one guy from that one show that one time, right?
I literally did that last night with a friend. I have ChatGPT. And so I was like, there was a movie, Argentinian film. It was like detective movie, but he has like this love thing with this woman that he used to be new to the police force. Now she's the head of it. And the story takes place in 2 time frames. I'm saying this all aloud, and I'm saying I think it's Argentinian, and then this happens, and it's like, oh, you're probably talking about The Secret in Their Eyes, 2009. And I'm like, that's exactly what it was.
That's the one, yeah.
And so...
So what have you done? You've externalized your brain to the cloud.
Yeah.
And so now, what do you not have? Well, you don't have any memory.
True.
Right? So we all have either a culturally acquired form of ADHD or a culturally acquired form of Alzheimer's. And as Postman would argue, and I think as most world religions would argue, if you don't have a memory, you don't have an identity. And so a cut and pastable technology will produce a cut and pastable culture. And that's the issue. That's the problem. It's well, okay, what's worth knowing anymore? What's worth doing anymore? What's worth proceeding with? And that's why, I mean, the data is pretty grim. It's the most anxious, lonely, depressed, suicidal age we've ever lived in history. 45% of college graduates will get a job that doesn't require a college degree. And 80% of Gen Z, when looking for a job, they won't take a job unless their employer allows them to post to social media during work hours, right? In other words, is a very strong, I mean, the average number of hours of screen time today, 13.35 hours per day. Out of a 16-hour day, that's 84% of your waking life.
Yeah.
That's a figure ground reversal where reality itself has seeded into the background. People talk about this like with the, what is the Apple Vision Plus or Pro goggles?
Yeah.
You know, like, oh, this is going to flip and do a figure ground reversal with reality. It's like, no, that happened years ago. That happened years ago with screen time and devotion to it. That reality, class time, my job, these are all just interruptions into my virtual mode of being.
Right.
And so that's the problem, is in the mode of being digital or being on the internet, what is that mode? That mode is passivity. That mode is being a spectator. That mode is consumption, not creation.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's very rare somebody does something really enjoyable or cool, like traveling, without posting about it.
Yeah.
Because it's like, well, who's enjoying this? You know what I mean? I gotta show that I'm enjoying this. You know what I mean?
Back when X was called Twitter, 80% of tweets were retweets. right? So 20% of people are actually producing some original content, and 80% are going, hey, look at this. I saw this. Hey, me too. You know?
It goes back to that less are creators, less are participating,
Yeah.
more are simply consuming.
Now, I don't know if that's also a pattern that's just true because human nature is that way. And 4 out of 5 people want to follow, not lead. I really don't know the answer to that question. Like that's a question that I've never actually looked into. Is that just a standard sort of default setting in the cultural algorithm at any media age? But it seems, just anecdotally and perceptually, it seems like this seems worse.
So, you know what's interesting to me? I was talking to our mutual friend Sean.
Yeah.
He was good at pointing out that listening to like 10-minute book summaries on YouTube or Blinkist is an app, which is literally like a 15-minute book summary. Have you heard about this?
Yeah.
So
I've never listened to it, but I know about it.
that one didn't appeal to me for some reason because I'm like, well, I already have like YouTubers who do this anyway, so I could just listen to them. But so what I noticed is I never read any of the books that I listened to the summaries for because I was like, I get the idea, I got the thesis.
Oh yeah.
And I can work with the thesis. It's interesting. I could think about it for a while. But I also started listening to a podcast called Founders. And as listeners to this podcast will find out, it's one of my favorites. It's one of the reasons I like it so much is it's incredibly simple and it actually reinvigorated my love for reading because the podcast is just biographies of founders or just monumental figures like Winston Churchill, certain war veterans like Alistair Urquhart, who suffered greatly in the Pacific Theater and survived, like even getting knocked back by the Hiroshima bomb blast when he was in Japan. Crazy stuff.
Wow.
Scottish guy. But like, it's enough detail. So it's about an hour and a half. He's just reading through his quotes and then cross-referencing other stories that he remembers that are like that. But it's detailed enough to make me be like, oh, I wanted more of that. So it actually made me, buy the book on Churchill and be like, buy the book on Bob Dylan, which I was like, that was fascinating. I got to listen to more of this. And what I noticed is the long-form content, like podcasts and long-form interviews, actually did a lot for me in terms of engaging the source material, whereas the shorter form stuff did not.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's very interesting because I think it's actually pushed out the middle. There's either the short reductionist soundbite version of everything or the super hyper-focused, hyper-detailed, long version of, well, you can't really call yourself a sushi lover unless you really, and then you have to know every species of fish and every way of cutting and filleting and every way of type of rice and every, in other words, there's a hyper specialism that comes with a generic age and a generalist age.
We have a lot of short form stuff that's on the rise.
Yeah.
Everyone's adopted that now. TikTok kind of started that, then Instagram adopted that, and now YouTube is adopting it. But we also have 7-hour podcasts. You know what I mean? We have 4-hour podcasts. Like, these are not rare.
I don't know a 7-hour podcast.
Oh, Lex Friedman. He had one with Bology. I think I'm saying that name right. But
and how many people listen to it the whole way through?
He would only know that, but I can just tell the views, and the views are based on I don't know what percentage of listening, but any percentage of a 8-hour podcast. Let me look it up, actually. I'm going to cheat here. It is almost 1 million views.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's pretty good
that's real. Yeah.
For a long, but they exist. So 7 hours, 47-minute podcasts, right? And a lot of Joe Rogan's podcasts are around 3 hours, and he's the top podcaster in the world, highest paid podcaster in the world, as far as I know. And so I think you're right. I think it's like the middle is disappearing. It's like extremely short or extremely long. And there are some people, I know people who never venture in the long and only stay in the short. I tend to do both because I think how I view short stuff is it's great for hooks. It's good for advertising. It's good for getting someone interested.
Yeah.
How do you view people like Jonathan Haidt? He's not exactly a media ecologist, but I feel like he's talking about a lot of the same things.
Yeah, I find him very, very valuable. And again, anybody that can bridge a divide or bridge a gap, and maybe just as a child of divorce, this has always interested me. And how do you speak so that religious and non-religious can speak to each other? How do you speak so that men and women can speak to each other? How do you speak so that conservatives and liberals can speak to each other, or theists and atheists. There's always, I think, a need for the not necessarily conciliatory voice or reconciling voice, but the ability to tolerate being in the same room with an opposing view and articulate eloquently both sides. That's, allegedly and ideally what a college education is teaching you to do, is how to know your thoughts and know your opponent's thoughts and reasonably appreciate why they think the way they do and not despise them or have contempt for them for doing so.
And you're talking about coddling of the American mind, right?
Well, that also just some of his talks on, I forget if this was a book or not, but I saw his TED talk on conservatives and liberals about, you think of it as, liberals don't care what you do with your body. And conservatives are all obsessed with sexual morality. He says, well, liberals are actually very concerned with the body. They care whether they put organic carrots and grapefruit juice into them or not. And so it's a different locus of concern, but it's still around the body. And so showing that actually we all have the same areas of interest and focus and concern, it's just we manifest it differently.
Right.
So,
but what he does, you wouldn't consider that media ecology. It's more social psychology or something like that?
yeah, but in other words, it's media ecological thinking because it's systems thinking. It's systems, if conservatives can make a morality of sexual behavior, well, so too can liberals make a morality of vegetarianism, right? Mm-hmm. And so the need to tie the behavior to a hierarchy of ethical values and then sort of preach it and evangelize for it, right? I think Haidt's good at showing, hey, we both do this.
Right.
It's not, oh, those preachy, religious people. I wish they'd stop doing that. It's no, people are preachy. What's his name? One of my favorite writers, Chris Hedges. Chris Hedges made the same point about the new atheists, right? That the new atheists are far more fundamentalist than the Bible thumpers of old because they're extremely shrill and dogmatic and fervent in their attempts to convert, new believers to their disbelief.
Interesting.
So the psychology of it is, manifest. I think I forget who said it, but it was pointed out during the COVID vaccine campaign was, you don't want to throw in your towel with right-wingers or left-wingers. You want to know who are the authoritarians that are going to take away bodily autonomy because they come in all stripes and flavors.
Yeah.
Right? Who are the what they call Karens trying to tell you don't have a choice in this matter, right? This is for our collective good, which again just goes back to the old question of every society and every time and place in history is to deal with the rights of the individual versus the rights of the group, and it's a question of the polis. How are we gonna manage this one? So I think he's doing very good work that's very worth reading and following and understanding.
I think the interesting, the one that made my ears perk up when I listened to it was the study about women born after 1997 and their rate of anxiety and depression being through the roof compared to everyone else, and it's not even close.
Wow.
And they were the first generation to have social media in junior high.
Yeah.
And so he is looking at things in relation to new technologies or new mediums, actually.
Yeah.
So the technology of social network was available, but now the medium of social network is everyone has it.
Yeah. Well, that is true media ecology. Is that in the Coddling of the American Mind book, the 97 study?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I haven't read that one.
And he just wrote a new one, Anxious Generation.
Yeah. That's in my Amazon cart. I haven't gotten or read it yet.
So going back to what you were saying earlier about Einstein's quote, can you repeat that? About memorization?
If I remember it correctly, he said something to the effect of never memorize anything that you could look up, which in the age of ChatGPT means, you don't even have to buy the textbook anymore.
You know what's interesting? So as a avid user of ChatGPT, everybody makes fun of me at work for this because I literally took a picture of our entire wine menu and had it describe each wine in detail for 350 wines, and it can do that because that has access to the internet, and it already has the inbuilt data of most wines.
Okay.
And so really good for me as somebody who's trying to memorize a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I came up with like this master list. And I also had to come up with an Excel sheet for me to understand the distribution of tips, because we have a tip pooling system.
Yeah.
And everyone has a different percentage depending on how many people work that night. And so I've already caught in like numerous errors that the hotel made, and we've gotten a lot of money from it. So,
Wow.
so I use it all the time. I find it really useful. But
Yeah. It's a good fine-tooth comb.
here's what I would say about that. And then I want to ask you a little bit about AI. But I look at it like an advanced spell check. I think I'm not going to ask it what it thinks about anything because it doesn't think.
But you alone are one of the people that knows that.
So that's
A lot of people actually think it can do my thinking for me.
I'm actually a little disappointed in certain people who keep posing this question. Is it sentient? Is it self-aware? And I'm like, seriously, like we've had this kind of technology for a while. I understand this is a huge leap forward. And the fact that it can understand pictures, understand why a meme is funny, it can do that. I look at it like, oh, I'm not going to use spell check because I need to know how all words are spelled. Well, it's like, yes, I mean, I understand if somebody did that, but I'm not going to do that. So I want to see if I'm spelling things correctly, and maybe that I am losing a little bit of my memory of how things are being spelled. But it's one of those things that I think most people were willing to sacrifice.
Yeah.
And there's certain things with like the Excel spreadsheet, for instance, I don't need to know everything about that. I'm using it for one purpose right now.
Yeah.
And so if it can help me build that, which it did, I think that's super cool and helpful. So, but what I was saying about ChatGPT, even though everybody makes fun of me for using it all the time, and now I use Claude by Anthropic, which is more advanced actually, I don't trust it. You know what I mean? So in other words, I actually trust YouTube more than I trust ChatGPT because it's a person. So like, and also because you get more interesting answers. So if want to get over a cold quickly, they've taken out so much of the inventiveness and organicness of the AI to make it safer, so it doesn't tell you something that you could sue them for. It's like, hey, I tried that thing it told me and I got, I had to go to the hospital or whatever. So they have to make it so safe, like, oh, talk to your doctor. It always says that. And then blah, blah, blah. On YouTube, it's like, okay, eat like 3 cloves of garlic raw, chop it up like this and blah, blah, blah. That's a more interesting answer. And it probably works better because it's also a little dangerous.
Yeah.
You could get sick. I mean, that's hard on your stomach. But my point being, as an avid user of the technology, I don't trust it because it's not like, for instance, a YouTuber, I can be like, oh, for this many years he's posted and this is his track record. And generally he's right. This has no track record. There's no accountability. I don't know where these answers are coming from. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I think that's everything. I think for separating, the wine list into its descriptors, that's a useful tool for it. But, I'm dealing with students who they have a challenge reading the book. They have a challenge understanding the book. They have a challenge thinking, what are my thoughts about the book as distinguished from what are the thoughts of the author who wrote the book? And this is hard. So maybe ChatGPT could do my thinking for me, right? And so they have a besetting temptation to sort of offload it, in which case, well, then they don't learn anything. And also they realize I don't need to read the book if I'm going to use this tool to write my paper or even help me write my paper. So I think of it as like, remember the road atlases?
Oh, well, yeah.
Road atlases were the previous technology before GPS came out.
Before MapQuest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And think about what happens in your car when you're driving if your GPS breaks or if the GPS can't find the satellite. You are well and truly out of luck if you don't know already where you're going. Whereas, and I ask my students, I say, when you're in a car, can you point to north, south, east, and west just directionally? Do you have a sense of that? And the answer is not anymore. My GPS tells me, right? But I don't know. Whereas if you have a road atlas, you've had, a year or dozens of years of training in the relationship of the map to the territory, of the scale of the map to the size of the roads, of the directionality. And so if you're driving along with your road atlas and somehow somebody rolls down the window and it gets blown out the door and then gets taken off by an 18-wheeler going the opposite direction and it's not retrievable, you're still better off in figuring out where you're going than you would be with the GPS that can't find the satellite.
Right.
Because you're not bereft of the tool set that the road atlas taught you. Whereas the GPS teaches you nothing. The GPS
Right.
teaches you turn left now, and you either trust it and obey it or you don't. But you don't use the GPS to get there and then know which way is south and which way is north, thanks to the fact that it taught me.
Yeah.
You can, if it's a route and it's your commute, then yeah, after a week or two, you can turn it off and say, I don't need the GPS to help me because I know all the turns turn by turn because of muscle memory, and that takes over. But in general, I would never want to go across country without a road atlas. And so many people, I mean, one of the funniest, there's a whole genre of work on YouTube of hilarious technological fails. And probably the funniest, or one of the funniest ones I've ever seen is, the guy out in the actual stretch of Arizona or New Mexico desert highway where there's no gas station for 70 miles and he gets a flat tire and he's standing outside of his car trying to get a signal to Google or to YouTube video how to change a flat tire.
Yeah.
Without YouTube, he's helpless, but he's gone confidently on that journey because, well, of course there's Wi-Fi across the whole country. And of course I won't have to know anything before I set out on this adventure because whatever I need to know, I can always rely on the cloud delivering it to me. And that's it's a great assumption, but it's the same reason why people of a previous generation would keep candles in their house because they would know, well, the electricity might go out, And so you're going to want some backup lights here in case. Now we have electric candles. And so you go, okay, well,
Yeah, it's true.
turn on the electric candles. Oh, shoot, we didn't get batteries.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So you keep pushing it forward to the point where you actually find yourself in multiple situations to be in a truly, a level of incompetence and helplessness that you go, wait a minute, how did my culture get me to this place where I'm stuck in the middle of the Arizona desert and I don't know what to do? But sit here and wait for a stranger to pass by and hope they notice because I don't know how to talk to a stranger. Thanks to the fact that I now mediate all my relationships through this smartphone.
Right. Yeah. So there's a trade-off though. There's a certain level of convenience I'm willing to have at the sacrifice of not memorizing certain forms of data. Obviously, there's a limit to, like, for instance, even books to some extent, right? Like encyclopedias are going to limit your necessity for recall, right? Even like a dictionary or thesaurus are helping you understand the meaning of a word and related words. And using a thesaurus, I think, isn't going to hurt your understanding of language, right? When you say would help it, even though you're not necessarily memorizing it, you're using it when you need it.
But here's why. Because of the serendipitous happy accident. In other words, using a thesaurus or a dictionary is just like finding a book in the library. What you're also finding are the words before and after it and the books to the left and right of it. And in finding those, you go, oh, wait, this author wrote another book on a different, oh, this looks interesting. And did this book come before or after the one I'm looking up? And I mean, a lot of poets, they'll find a word in the dictionary and they'll discover, wow, this is so amazing. This word occurs right between this word and that word. And that's poetic in and of itself. Right?
So the physical, space, you're saying.
The geographical hunt for the necessities of life, the hunt for the figure takes place on the ground of the culture or the medium. And now we've just removed the ground. It's the biggest analogy I use when I'm teaching this is it's the difference between a digital clock and an analogic clock, right?
Right.
You look at your digital clock. What time is it right now?
12:22.
Right, because it's 12:22. It's just 12:22. That's all it is. And every time you look at your digital clock, it's just right now. Whereas when you look at an analogic clock, you go, oh, it's the middle of the day. It's lunchtime.
Yeah.
And it's 7 hours before sunset. And it's 12 hours before my paper is due at midnight. In other words, you get the figure of the time on the ground of my available remaining time.
Right.
And so analogic media always gave you figure ground relationships, and digital media just tells you, hey, it's just right now. So the way William Gibson put that, the guy that wrote Neuromancer and coined the term cyberspace, he said that if you're 15 years old or so today, you inhabit a sort of permanent digital atemporality, which is a really interesting way to put it, because that's a little bit like being outside of time in a suspended state of animation and almost like God. On the other hand, since you're outside of time, you don't perceive time passing, which is why the average American now gets married later than ever and is 29, and why a huge number of 45-year-olds are still living in their parents' basement. That why would I need to grow up when I live in a state of suspended animation? It's always right now.
Yeah.
There's no perception of time as a rushing river heading towards a waterfall in which my life ends. And so the actual commodity that God or nature gives us of you get this brief 78 years, use it well, that perception goes away. You'll always be young. You'll be forever 21. It's always the internet. It's always right now. It's always available.
Well, the irony is that it's always now and you're never in now. You know, you're never in the now. You're never present.
Yeah.
And so also what I've been noticing is like, I didn't even do that much interesting stuff last year. You know what I mean? It's just like, what did I do? And the things I remember. And so the way I've been making decisions is like, no, I want to remember this. You know what I mean? Because if you're not conscious of the present moment, you have nothing. You know what I mean? Later.
With students in college, I find a lot of them that are not art majors taking an art class. And I often ask, oh, tell me why you're doing that. And they'll say, well, either I don't know much about art and I'm just interested, or, well, I'm going to go through 4 years of college and I want to have something to show for it that I made with my own hands. And so they want to mark the occasion of I went to college and this was a painting or a sculpture or a drawing I did in college.
Yeah.
And so it's hugely significant to have physical markers.
Yeah, like putting up stones.
Yeah. Remembrance. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's something about it when a baby is born, you plant a tree in the backyard, and in 60 years, that's a really interesting story about that child and that tree. And there's a symbiotic relationship that is tangible and perceivable. And you have a picture of the baby next to this little sapling, and then a picture of the teenager next to a young tree, and then an old oak tree next to a picture of grandchildren.
Yeah.
And it's a life itself is an unfolding of perception manifested through physical materiality in time and space. And if you remove all that, right, you're doing violence to the theology of the West in a very large measure with, as I used to say back when Second Life was a big thing, like who needs a life after death when you have a second life right here, right now, right? If I can live in the eternal realm now in a discarnate, spiritual, disembodied state, I don't need a religion.
Right.
I don't need a theology. I have manifest the hope of salvation and the eternal afterlife right here and right now.
Well, I think the reality for a lot of people who actually do live like that is what Jonathan Haidt was pointing out in his book, The Anxious Generation, is it's all coming crumbling down and people are on in a mental health crisis.
Oh yeah.
And so
worse than ever.
Yeah. And he said it's pretty obvious, like no one thinks it's better. Most people who have the necessity of not having technology, like let's say at a youth camp or something like that, are happy that they don't have the ability to use their phone or be on the internet because they're forced to be present with other people. And I think the other important thing is the other people are forced to be present with them.
Yeah.
Because even if I get rid of my iPhone and all this other stuff, they're all still distracted. So I'm kind of alone. You know what I mean? So if no one else chooses to live like that, I'm actually further isolating myself.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like being an Amish man going to a shopping mall. Like, well, who do I talk to? And what do I, there's nobody here for me. But there was a study about camping, and they found that if you take kids' smartphones away, that it takes 5 days for the kids to be able to make and enjoy eye contact. But after those 5 days, they want to stay at camp forever. They love it. And so, one of the insights of the study was, you shouldn't have 3-day camp weekend getaways. That's not enough time for them to actually get out of their discarnate, ethereal self into their incarnate bodies and actually perceive the advantage of being embodied.
Yeah, and I think like even the kind of get together you were describing back in New York is something that can simulate a smaller version of that, in the sense that we're all putting aside, there's no TV, there's no... I was actually impressed by this. A few months ago, I met a group of musicians through this girl who works in town. She introduced me to her boyfriend who has a band, and she's like, oh, come over to band practice on Thursday night, and we make food, and, we have I have some beer there, and we just like hang out. And I was like amazed at the fact that, people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, it was like maybe 8 or 10 of us, no one looked at their phone, or like we just like sang songs we knew together, talked. I had a theological conversation with a guy who's like not a Christian anymore, but he had all of these reasons why. And that was like a 5-hour hangout where I didn't look at my phone except for like lyrics for a song I needed, but there was nothing in the way of
Yeah.
our socialization.
Yeah.
I was like, and I told multiple people about it. I was like, that was such a unique experience that is sad that it's that unique.
Yeah. No, it's very rare. Have you seen that meme on the internet that says, anybody want to go to someplace different tonight to look at our phones?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
like, what a depressing world that is.
Yeah.
That
I've
if-
seen
if
it all
that's
the
all we're
time.
gonna do, you know?
All the time as a server, a waiter seeing people who are on a date and the couple is on their phone. I'm just like, what's the point? Like you're spending $300-$400 for dinner and you're not even here, you know?
Well, there's some restaurants and also some credit cards now that are incentivizing diners to put the phone down, leave it in the car, or put it in a lockbox. And if you can put it in the lockbox for the entirety of the meal, you get a free dessert, or you get a coupon
Wow.
for the next meal.
Wow.
I mean, it's become a serious social crisis.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, so everyone knows there's something wrong. I think everyone knows there's a problem with social media and TikTok and overconsumption of everything. We've known this since television, since Neil Postman was talking about it in the 80s. Everyone knew that was a problem too.
Yeah.
But what are the effects of the church being uninformed on this topic?
Well, the effects are the church is less relevant than ever, and fewer people go than ever before. Right. In other words, the rise of the knowns, the great evangelical demographic drop off. People no longer get married, have children, start families, and go to church. I mean, all the Protestant denominations have a lower than 50% retention rate into the next generation. And so I'm always pointing out to my students, the only Protestant denomination that has a higher than 50% retention rate is actually the religion, higher than Judaism, Catholicism, and Hinduism. Hinduism, I think, has a 74 or 76% retention rate. Don't quote me. It's high up there. But the only one higher than that is actually the Amish. And depending on whose data you're looking at, it's like 85 to 95% retention rate. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the one culture, the one church culture, if you will, or denominational culture, if you will, that has categorically answered the question of how does technology affect our spiritual community, that they have the highest survival rate. They have the highest flourishing rate. They're doubling their numbers every 20 years. And, you think of the Amish as like Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and some counties in Ohio. But there's 32 Amish communities in America right now, and they're growing. And so they're in 32 states. And I think this is how the meek inherit the earth. I don't think it's a coincidence that, they actually know the cost of electricity. They know the cost of the automobile. They know the cost of TikTok.
Yeah.
And they say, we think that's too high a price. So why are they winning? In other words, think about can you imagine being in a culture in which you wanted to marry at 19 and you wanted to have 10 kids or 12 kids, right? In other words, in which life was that good and that desirable that it was like, I can't wait to start my family, There's no denomination that I know of, including Catholics, right, who have imparted to their young the lust for life, the desire for being a participant, not a spectator, to bringing the next generation into the world.
My only thing with that is I'm already hearing the other side saying, well, that's a forced community in the sense that maybe they just don't know enough about the world, and if they did, they'd leave. And if they did leave, their family wouldn't talk to them. Like, how do you respond to that? Like, is that true? Is that...
Yeah, it's a bit of a urban legend. The reality is they have their Rumspringa, they have their maturity, and they're an Anabaptist tradition, right? People forget there's only one reason for the two strands of the core beliefs of the Anabaptist tradition, which is we don't baptize our babies and we don't join the military. People forget that was driven by a technology in the 15th century called the printing press. There's no pre-15th century Amish or Mennonites.
Mm-hmm.
It's the printing press that would take church records of baptisms, and then the state would come through and say, let's see the church register. And they'd say, all these kids that were born this year, it's now 14 years later, round them up. We want to take them off to our wars. And the Anabaptists, the Mennonites and the Amish said, you know what? We don't like our boys being taken off to war against our better judgments or interests. We would like to keep them at home and like them not to fight in the war. So the only way to do that was to create a new theology in which they said, okay, you can only become a Christian, but join the church by making a confession of faith and a desire to join the community of the church as an adult. So the truth is, Amish go through a very serious discernment process and decide very seriously, do I want to be in the world and of the world, or do I want to be in the world but not of the world and stay in my Amish community?
It reminds me of like that thoughtfulness about the effects that technology has on us. Brought me to a Marshall McLuhan quote, and I'm going to read it so I don't get it wrong. He said, "The hidden aspects of the media are the things that should be taught because they have an irresistible force when invisible. These factors remain ignored and invisible, then they have an absolute power over the user."
Yeah.
It reminds me of like spiritual warfare of demonic activity.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Right.
I mean, again, just look at it in terms of life itself. How did we go? In Mexico, the average mother used to have 5 kids. Now she has 1. Average Muslim family has 6 people in the family. Average Amish family has 10 people in the family. Average American family has 3.13 people, right? How did that happen? Well, the answer is, economics and technology have now scared you into fearing that rather than looking forward to that. Why'd you get married at 29? We ask, the young, and they say, well, I mean, I had to go to college and then I had to get financially stable. And 29 was the earliest I could marry. Well, okay. But what does that mean? Well, it means if fertility drops off at 35, if you haven't had a child yet, then guess what? You're going to have 1.4 children, right? In other words,
Yeah.
you're going to have the number of kids that the default algorithm has kind of corralled you into. And so if at 29 or 30 you start thinking about kids, it's too late for you to actually make a meaningful choice. The choice has already been made for you. And so it's in that sense that it's an invisible technology. It's an invisible effect that the media is having. Nobody thinks it's robbing me of my life force. It's robbing me of my, right? In other words, what's the technology doing? Well, it's persuading you invisibly and silently to turn your family tree into a stump.
And to preserve your autonomy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And to think that, your life is about you and you are the only thing that matters, when in fact, ask anybody in an old folks home what they regret. What they regret is thinking their life was only about them. What they regret is not doing more to produce life in the next generation.
Last question, and then any final thoughts. What's your view of podcasts?
I love it. I think podcasts are like all digital technology, which is the future of the digital is the acoustic. And that's simply to say that the move from orality to literacy to print to electronic to digital is actually not a linear progression, but a circular one. And the digital is the return to the acoustic. So in the same way that this is the return to the oracle of ancient Greece, and the Pythia, which is the female voice of a middle-aged woman who's disguising her voice to sound younger, right? That's Siri, that's Alexa, that's Cortana, that's all your digital, that's your GPS. The default voice is always a female voice. So I think the return to orality can actually only help create a better equilibrium of the senses, or the global sensorium, if you will, to use McLuhan's terms. And I think people are listening now more than ever. And I think they're listening now more than they're watching, simply because we have to listen more than watch if we're going to succeed at multitasking without killing ourselves. And I give you a very hard example of that, and that is that if you look at the data on vehicular deaths from car crashes, there's 40,000 minimum every year that die in car crashes in America. And the Department of Transportation will tell you it's 23 to 25% of those are happening and driven by and caused by directly distracted driving. Well, what is distracted driving? They've defined the terms very carefully, and there's three types of distraction. There's visual distraction, where your eyes are not on the road. There's manual distraction, where your hands are not on the wheel. And then there's mental distraction, where your mind is not on driving. Well, guess what the smartphone represents? The smartphone represents all three of those distractions, right? What am I doing while I'm in my car? Well, I'm busy trying to answer this text, right? So I'm not looking out the windshield. I'm not thinking about driving, and I'm not got my both hands on the wheel. I've got one hand on the thing. So I tell parents all the time, every time I get a chance, you want to save your kid from dying in one of these unnecessary smartphone-caused crashes and deaths? Buy them a manual stick shift car. You have to actually have both hands on the wheel and the stick shift to drive it. Now, that's mostly true, except when they get up to highway speed on the highway, and then they can start texting, and then that's where a lot of these crashes happen. So I think the acoustic-only podcast, right, is a good solution to that. And let's be honest, most people, myself included, we sound better than we look. There's not much to look at anyway. Whereas there's things to listen to that are worth, conversations worth having, and ideas worth discussing. It was never the case that we had to see everything before we died, whereas we do want to hear as many ideas as we can and understand what do we think about these things to decide how to choose how to live and go forward in our lives. So I think the return to the acoustic realm that the digital world represents and that podcast represents is a good thing, and I'm all for it. You still have the problem of the number of hours in the day and the number of hours of podcasts produced every day,
right?
And so you'll never catch up, and you'll never be able to listen to all of it. But I do think the good conversations will get out there, and I think the cream rises to the top, as it always has. And I think, like the bards of old, or the prophets of old, or the preachers of old, people will find what's worth listening to, and word spreads. So if it's good enough for God to make the world by, and Jesus to preach his sermons by, I think it's good enough for us to use in the 21st century to try to reassemble the fragmented parts of our culture that have just kind of slipped through our hands.
Dr. Schuchardt, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Pleasure.